Hi everyone, a very happy new year to you, and welcome to the 50th episode of Now and Men, the podcast on men, masculinities and gender equality. I'm Stephen Burrell, and I'm coming to you today from the land of the boomerang people.
Yes, hi everyone. I can't quite believe that we've been doing the podcast for 3.5 years now, Stephen.
I know, Sandy. I feel the same way. I feel like it's been an incredibly eye-opening experience to get to speak to so many different people, who are doing amazing work in all sorts of different areas over 50 episodes now. So yeah, to kind of mark this anniversary of sorts, we wanted to do something a little bit different with this episode, although Sandy has pointed out that we're having a lot of special episodes recently, so we probably don't want to overdo that, but yeah.
So we thought for this special episode, we would spend the first half talking about something very important to all of us on the podcast today, care for the environment and how it relates to issues of masculinity. And in the second half, we'll reflect on our experience of running the podcast so far and on some of our favourite episodes.
Yes, and so to help us do this, we have with us somebody who I've been collaborating with closely on these issues, Dr Cassie Pedersen. Cassie is a lecturer in criminology and criminal justice at Federation University, which is based in the state of Victoria here in Australia. Her background is in philosophy, with her PhD being on the theory of trauma, and currently her work focuses predominantly on harms against animals. And I should add, as a disclaimer as well, Cassie is also my partner.
So, hi Cassie, and thanks for joining us today.
Hi everyone, thanks so much Sandy and Stephen for having me today. I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations.
Now, one of the reasons we wanted to do this episode is because the two of you have just published an article in the Journal of Criminology, which is entitled From Men's Violence to an Ethic of Care, Ecofeminist Contributions to Green Criminology. So could you just start off by telling us a bit more about what the article's about and what is it you're trying to argue in that piece?
Yeah, so to start off with how we came to this, or how I at least came to this paper, my research was around men's violence against women and how to prevent that. But since I was much younger, I've always been interested in environmental issues and, passionate about things like climate change. And I've got 2 young nieces, and I suppose, thinking about them and the world they're growing up in, it just felt more and more kind of important to me that I try and do something more about climate change as well. But I hadn't really thought about how that linked to the work I was already doing. But so I started doing more reading around it, including people we've had on this podcast, like Bob Peace and their work. And it actually had a really big impact on me. And it started to become more and more clear to me that there are actually a lot of connections between these issues of, men's violence, really, and the climate crisis and the destruction of the environment. I think if we think about climate change, people often think about it as being something which is about industry, industrial capitalism, maybe colonialism as well. But we don't talk as much, I don't think, about gender or patriarchy and what role they're playing in it as well. But actually, I think if you think about some of the kind of dominant norms and expectations we have about masculinity, which we talk about a lot on this podcast, things like be strong, be tough, be in control, be able to kind of dominate over others potentially, be powerful, perhaps be independent and self-reliant. Actually, these kind of manifest themselves as well in how we relate to nature and the environment. Perhaps we can see in how we as humans, but perhaps especially among men, we may feel this sense of entitlement to treat nature how we want, to kind of use it as a resource, like endlessly, to be able to exploit it for however we want to, without really thinking about the impact that might be having. I mean, for example, I think one way in which we as men can prove our masculinity is by kind of dominating over the environment around us, showing that we are powerful, we can conquer our environment potentially. So if you think about some of the most environmentally damaging behaviors, like driving cars or flying or sailing big yachts, all of which very environmentally damaging, but also they're quite powerful ways of kind of showing our masculinity, aren't they? And so I don't think it's any coincidence that men do, on average, obviously there's a huge generalizations, but on average men do have higher carbon emissions than women. Also, men often express less concern about climate change than women. Perhaps that's something, caring about the environment might be something which we associate with femininity, and it's somehow emasculating to be seen to be caring and concerned or anxious about things like climate change. This idea of being a hippie it's kind of feminized, isn't it? And it's not a thing that you necessarily want to be associated associated with as a man.
And do you want to say a little bit more about what green criminology is? Because I'm not sure that all our listeners are going to understand that term. And ecofeminism, for that matter, as well, because those are core elements that you describe in the paper.
So I guess broadly speaking, green criminology, it initially focused on environmental crimes, more looking at the impact of environmental crimes on humans, I suppose. So in terms of like distribution of natural resources, and who environmental crimes are impacting, it's often the most marginalised groups of people. But I guess more recently it's been categorised as looking at crimes against the environment, non-human animals as well, and that's my space, and also ecosystems. And we bring an ecofeminist lens to that in this article because, I guess green criminology has tended to, I guess, have somewhat of a masculine bias, which is probably the case for most forms of criminology. So it hasn't really taken gender as seriously as it could have, and there are a few really notable exceptions to that. So I guess one of the points of this article is to enrich green criminology with ecofeminism. So ecofeminism, and I think you spoke about this a little bit in your episode with Bob Peace, but it started in the 70s, and it's really, I guess it was responding to a lack of gendered consciousness within environmental movements, and I guess a lack of environmental consciousness within feminist movements, and trying to bridge those things together by making environmental and ecological issues feminist concerns.
Yeah, I first came across ecofeminism about that time, actually, in the work of Petra Kelly. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but she was one of the founders of the German Green movement and was very focused on peace, anti-nuclear work, the environment, and so on and so forth. And she was a big name at that time, sadly no longer with us. But I suppose what all I'm saying, to reinforce your point, is that ecofeminism has actually been around for quite a long time. And it is good to see that it's still, having some influence and it's still regarded as significant. Let me ask you a little bit more about violence against animals, Cassie, because I think that's your area of specialism. We discussed men's experiences of veganism on a previous episode with Kadri Arvik, but we didn't talk so much then about the role of masculinity in contributing to different forms of harm against other animals. Do you want to explain that a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess there's probably 2 points to address there. Firstly, that violence against animals, as well as environmental violence, as Stephen was saying, is a problem with men and masculinities. And I guess secondly, that violence against the environment and animals are overlapping and interrelated to other types of men's violence. So, I guess one thing to note is that violence against animals within our society is something that's completely routine and normalised. It's deeply entrenched within our everyday practices, and I think that we're all complicit in it to some extent or another, but men are playing a central role in perpetrating this violence. So there are a whole host of different examples we can draw on, things like hunting and shooting wild animals. I'm using air quotes here. Things like that are motivated by power, control, and thrill-seeking behaviour, and these are seen as being at the core of masculinity. Things like the illegal wildlife trade as well, so kind of collecting taxidermied animals or ivory. This is another way of demonstrating man's domination of nature, capturing, conquering, putting animals on display. Something that was discussed in your episode with Kadri Arvik quite well, I think, is the idea of meat eating and how that is linked to masculinity. And Stephen and I in this paper argue that that can be understood as a form of men's violence. So we know that globally men eat more meat than women, and meat eating is associated with masculine traits like strength and virility. In Australia, like the barbecue. I don't know about there in the UK, but it's a real.
It's not really barbecue weather here, Cassie.
It's summer here, so prime time for barbecues. Tofu burgers.
I get your point.
Case.
I get your point.
Men are less likely to be vegan and vegetarian. And yeah, I guess when they do become vegan and vegetarian, their masculinity can be called into question. We've all heard phrases like soy boys. And I guess just another one too, that men are more likely to work in slaughterhouses as well. And there's been research that's revealed kind of the spillover of violence that's enacted in slaughterhouses into the community. So it's been found that within one study at least, that slaughterhouse employment has led to increases in total arrest rates, and including arrests for violent crimes and sexual assault. Men's violence against animals doesn't occur in a vacuum.
Yeah, I'm sure we could do a whole episode on slaughterhouses. That'd be extraordinary. I mean, most of us know so little about what goes on, in the meat industry. But I mean, you both raised a huge number of issues there from the paper. But I guess that also raises the question: what we do in response to all this. And you talk in the paper about cultivating an ethic of care among men and boys. What do you mean by that? And what does it have to do with how we treat the environment and other animals?
Well, I think if you look at something like climate change, you can just, it's so emblematic of how disconnected we are from the world around us, isn't it? That it's just getting warmer and warmer, and we're not really doing anything about it, and it's just not sustainable. We just cannot live on this planet if it's on fire. But that's the thing, that we've become so disconnected from nature because we see ourselves as being better than nature, right? As better than other animals, that somehow we're unique and we're different from all other animals as humans because we're rational. And actually because we can be unemotional and objective and detached. And these are very much things which we associate with masculinity. And actually, I think you can see then why it becomes easier as well to perpetrate violence against other people or other living things or against the environment. Because if you see yourself as being different and separate and disconnected, it becomes a lot easier, I think, doesn't it, to be violent and abusive. Because you think you have the right to do that, or perhaps you just don't feel much of an emotional consequence to that, perhaps. Also because our emotions are associated with nature to some extent as well, right? Something which we should be able to control or detach ourselves from as men. As well. But I think, so I do think that that's a large part of why we've got to where we are. And so therefore I think the solution is to try and break down some of these norms and expectations we have, which are particularly associated with masculinity, and recognize actually that we are very much reliant and dependent on nature. We can't survive without this environment around us, without all sorts of other animals and beings. We live in an ecology, right? And we are dependent on all parts of the ecology. So I guess an ethic of care is trying to recognize that relationality, and by recognizing that we're dependent on others, that actually we can play a positive role, an active role in caring for others, in caring for our environment, for our community, for other human beings, for our friends, our family, but also for other animals or plants as well. But of course, we benefit from that in turn, right? It's a mutually beneficial, reciprocal relationship. And just as one example of that, there's so much research about how, men, any of us as humans, benefit a great deal from spending more time in nature, being connected with nature, having relationships with other animals. And actually, I do think that this is something which we could be embedding a lot more in work with men and boys, and in education, actually, about the environment and about climate change, is this kind of gendered awareness of the dynamics of this.
Do you have anything to add to that, Cassie?
Yeah, I guess just that an ethic of care, it encapsulates the way that we act in the world. It's something that we can put into practice, but it's more than that. It's a way of reorienting how we view the world around us and our relationships with the more than human world and each other. It just challenges the idea of that we're independent and autonomous and rational, and that's obviously really important for constructions of masculinity in it, isn't it? And instead kind of sees us as being enmeshed in relationships.
I mean, you talked a minute ago about the meaning of ecofeminism, and I was wondering, given what you've both said, really, how that's impacting on your own lives. What got you interested in ecofeminism in the first place?
Yeah, I guess personally, I approached ecofeminism from a vegan ecofeminist perspective, which is, it's definitely central to ecofeminism, but I suppose it's kind of a bit aside as well, in that it's got more of a focus on non-human animals. This idea of an ethic of care really resonated strongly for me, I think. I became a vegetarian when I was a teenager, and for me, that wasn't necessarily rooted in rational, logical arguments about animals being sentient and having rights and all of that kind of thing. It was much deeper and much more emotional. It was about having compassion and caring deeply about other beings on the planet. And I think an ethic of care can really mobilize that. Of course, it's important to not be a essentialist and say that women are naturally compassionate and caring. But I think, sometimes we do act from a place of emotion, and that's really important. Ecofeminism, though, has been really powerful for me because I guess showing that animal rights and animal justice is a feminist issue. I'd kind of put these things separate in my mind, and um, I guess looking at things intersectionally and kind of seeing the intersection between violence against women, violence against animals. I guess we do see overlaps between the oppression of minoritized groups, like people of color, First Nations people, people with disability, but I've mainly been looking at the overlap or interconnection between the oppression of animals and women. And yeah, I guess we see things like, sexist language often animalizes women. Women are referred to as bitches, cows, bunnies, pieces of meat. Women's bodies are kind of metaphorically carved up through sexual objectification, and that countered with and this is something that Carol Adams talks about really powerfully in The Sexual Politics of Meat, but animals' bodies are literally carved up. So, yeah, I guess understanding women's oppression and also women's liberation as being intricately caught up with animal oppression and animal liberation has been hugely powerful for me because, yeah, I guess only a few years ago did I start to see that, animal advocacy is a feminist issue.
Just to pick up on what Cassie was saying, I think that's one of the gifts of feminism, really, certainly for me, is helping you to draw the connections between different things, because all these different issues are very much interconnected. And that was something which was very powerful for me as a young man when I first started learning about feminism, and this idea of the continuum of sexual violence, from Liz Kelly, that different kinds of behaviors, different forms of violence and abuse and harassment towards women are actually interconnected in the kind of the power relations that underpin them and which they help to perpetuate. And so that's very much the same for me with ecofeminism as well. I do think actually with the environmental movement, I don't think there is enough consideration really of gender, as a factor in helping us to understand what's going on and also the impacts of different things. So as an example of that, in terms of another way that this connects with men's violence, there's lots of research which shows that actually the climate crisis is exacerbating gender inequality. So for example, in natural disasters, which of course climate change is making more frequent and more intense, gender-based violence often gets worse. We see levels of domestic abuse often increasing, in the wake of disasters. That was something Bob Pease talked about here in Australia, for example, after bushfires or floods. Things like sexual violence can often get worse as well in the kind of chaos and insecurity and precarity in the wake of disasters, as lots of women might be in kind of temporary or insecure accommodation, for example. So yeah, gender inequality is actually getting worse as a consequence of this as well. So I guess that shows how different kinds of men's violence, if we're looking at violence against the environment as potentially being a kind of form of men's violence, it can create the conditions for other kinds of violence to happen as well and to potentially get worse. Again, to use an example here in Australia, there's a big mining industry, and it's this kind of fly-in, fly-out mining industry, and there's research which suggests that these are very, where this mining is happening, obviously very destructive towards the planet, but also there are these very masculinized spaces where there are also very high levels of, violence, sexual harassment towards women, for example, and also actually, very poor mental health among men, to show that, again, that these things are so interconnected. I think feminists are really highlighting how, this is based on these socially constructed gender norms, and men are just as capable of caring for the planet. And actually that really, I think that offers, at a time when lots of men are struggling and when there are lots of kind of quite harmful role models, let's call them, out there for boys and men, I think this actually offers a really positive way forward and a positive identity for boys and men to kind of care for the environment.
And we've talked before on the podcast about various forms of activism and community organising around climate and nature, and it makes me wonder about what activism actually is, and having been peripherally involved, should I say, in some Extinction Rebellion activities and other environmental action. I think there's a problem with the word activism, really, that it suggests that there's a small cadre of people who are the activists, and that other people are somehow excluded from that. And in terms of what we need to do, it feels to me that we need everyone's contribution. Not just those people who are politically active at the centre, on the streets raising issues of banks, insurance, and their harmful activities and so on. We need those people who are undertaking conservation activities at the weekend, in ponds and so on. And there's kind of like a continuum there. We actually need to broaden out the activity in response, rather than just considering, there's a small group of people who are somehow going to solve this through disruption or whatever. So do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Sandy. I should add, I have done a research project about this, which hopefully eventually I'll be publishing a book on a few years from now. So I interviewed like 43 people involved in environmental activism in the UK. And I think you're absolutely right. Of course we need, as you say, we need to be holding people in power to account. We need to be challenging the corporations that are contributing, the vast majority to this problem. And that's another thing, of course. Who is it that's dominating these corporations? Well, they're predominantly run by men, which is another way in which this is gendered. And actually, who is it that's working in the fossil fuel industries and other extractive industries? Again, it's predominantly men, which is another reason, of course, why men might be more reluctant to recognize how bad climate change is. And that's another thing to mention as well. I think that today, just as we're recording this, there's a new news item out saying that the last year, 2024, was the hottest on record, and heat rises surpassed 1.6 degrees. It just shows you how deep this problem is. But also other research as well showing that the richest contributing so much more in terms of carbon emissions than other people. So I think that's a nuance we need to recognise as well, that, well, first of all, who is that richest 10%? Well, it's predominantly men, again. But at the same time, obviously, some men have a lot more power and a lot more privilege and a lot more wealth than others. So we do have different responsibilities here. But I think we men as a group, we are contributing disproportionately to this, and I think we do have a particular responsibility to do something about it. But I think you're absolutely right. I don't think that has to include going on marches or protests or occupying the streets, or, not to say that's not important as well. And I actually think this connects to issues of men and feminism as well, really. Yeah, I think exactly as you said, Sandy, it's about our everyday lives, isn't it? I think we have to embody the change we want to see, as Gandhi said. I think we have to put this into practice in our day-to-day lives. And I think it does come back to that ethic of care, by showing care in our own behaviour for each other, for the environment, for other animals. I think we can model the kind of the world that we want to see and actually create that. That's how we create social change, really, isn't it? Is by showing the social change that we want to see to others, and actually creating a community and a context which others want to join. Because I think sometimes activism can also feel a bit exclusive, can't it? And a bit like people can feel a bit wary and nervous about joining. But actually, if we show that this is something which is actually, it's really good to be connected to nature. We all really benefit from that. So you should get involved as well. You know what I mean? Because actually, the way that we're living currently is doing us so much harm, as well as the environment. So yeah.
Well, I was just thinking in terms of, how we get more people involved. I'm quite drawn towards the work of a guy called Rupert Reed, who was a professor in East Anglia in UK. And one of the people who established Extinction Rebellion originally, he has talked more recently about what he calls the climate majority, I guess. And there's an organisation based around that now. And the idea being that, we can't, as we've been saying, achieve all the goals we need to just through pressure on the street, but we need to broaden it out, and we need to get parents in school taking action, professional groups, lawyers, people in the health service take this seriously, and I think we need to, as they are doing, seed some more activities which go much wider.
Yeah. I guess it's a contentious category, isn't activism, like how we choose to define it. And I guess it can be intimidating, and whether or not we consider our everyday actions as a form of activism, or if it is, something that's more about taking to the streets. But I think that our everyday choices do count for something, although of course we need broader structural change. But I guess there is that reciprocal relationship, isn't there, between the personal things that we do every day and the broader structural, like we reinforce these ideas.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about gender and activism as well. I mean, in a way, you could say, well, activist movements, or whatever we want to call them, gender dynamics will mirror what's going on in wider society to an extent, and I think gender justice, as you've said, has lower priority. There's a risk that men will still dominate decision making and strategy within these movements. The women will be in supporting roles. There are also pressures on women's time. There's the risks of bullying and harassment and abuse within movements. So all of those things, are actually part of the equation, within activism, to use that as a shorthand. And not to mention, different strands within feminism, of course, as well. So the dominance of Western middle class feminism, perhaps, as opposed to other aspects which take intersectionality more seriously. So there are a whole range of issues which apply, from through a gendered lens to this kind of movement as well. And I suppose I'm wondering how good organisations like, or networks or movements like XR have been in actually addressing some of those issues that I've just mentioned. I do think, there's certainly an attempt to be, less hierarchical. There's a high representation of women within XR. There's space for listening, for sharing. There's the notion that we are, this is a term they use quite often, we are all crew. But having said that, I think there's a relative silence on gender equality as an issue. So, none of these things are perfect as well. That's the other thing to say, is that we're all feeling our way, and we'll make mistakes, and we need to sort of revisit all these issues and think about these things in terms of gradual progress, rather than somehow there's going to be some epiphany where gender and other equalities issues will inevitably be included at all times in a perfect way. That's just not how it happens, is it? Lives are messy. Activism is messy.
Yeah, I think they're really insightful points, especially what you were talking about in terms of intersectionality, right? Because I think, if we're agitating for change on one level, say, environmental or animal rights, but then also reinforcing and reproducing other really problematic social structures like patriarchy or gendered power relations, then yeah, it's a problem. And yeah, activist spaces do very much reflect broader social norms. I think it is interesting. And I certainly have seen gender play out within animal activism as well, which I think has been a bit different to environmental activism. I guess an example we're seeing a lot is lingerie protesting. So I guess women wearing lingerie, taking to the streets, and sometimes having signs like eat pussy, not animals. And I think that some of these activists are doing what they can to draw attention to the cause, and I think that's really admirable, and I think that's really important. But I do kind of wonder, and will only it'll just serve to reproduce other really problematic images we have of women. And I guess unless we kind of see the oppression of women and animals as being kind of interrelated, that we kind of need to liberate both groups, right, rather than one at the expense of the other.
I do actually think as well that drawing these intersectional connections is actually really beneficial as well, because in terms of broadening these movements, for example, recruiting more working class people, for example, or more people of colour, well, they're the groups that are actually impacted worst, by environmental degradation, or, they're the communities that are most likely to live near slaughterhouses, which are these really horrible environments often, aren't they? You know what I mean? So actually, it can be a really effective way of bringing more people in as well. And I do think that there's something also, that it can help us in terms of developing more impactful messages, because something that came up in my research was that actually, I think in lots of ways, environmental activists, animal activists do actually challenge wider gender norms. I think, Ray Winconnell did research on this, didn't she, a very long time ago, which highlighted that like men involved in environmentalism were actually kind of challenging norms of masculinity, and maybe were already non-conforming to those norms before they got involved in the activism, and maybe that helped them to get involved in that or to become interested in that. But as you said, on the other hand, we do also see these harmful norms coming up within these movements as well, but also in the messaging. So like in my research, it was mentioned quite a bit that there can be quite a lot of emphasis on the science, when it comes to climate change, and these quite rationalist arguments, also quite confrontational messaging and tactics. And there are huge debates, of course, about whether that works or not. But I think that can scare some people off, or some people can switch off. And I think, there's a real need for a kind of empathetic approach, for a caring approach, and for an approach which really understands the kind of the emotional dynamics of this, right? That people feel terrified and really anxious about this for understandable reasons. So you can understand why people might want to be in denial about it. And actually, I think this goes back to the conversation we had with Bob Peace, where he talked about if we can actually encourage men to reflect on our emotions and the fact that we are vulnerable, but not run away from that, but actually kind of embrace it, and the fact that, as I said before, we are dependent on nature and the environment, therefore we have to treat it with care.
Yeah, I certainly share some of the sort of fear about where we're going. I mean, only today there's the fires in Los Angeles and so on, and we've been talking on the podcast here about climate change, but actually, more properly, we should probably be talking about climate breakdown and ecological breakdown. This is actually where we're at, as you mentioned, Stephen.
Now, as this is our 50th episode, we thought it would also be interesting to spend some time reflecting on the podcast itself, so the conversations we've had so far, and how it might develop in the future. And so, Cassie, one of the reasons we invited you on this episode, in addition to your brilliant work, is that you have actually, I believe, very kindly listened to every episode of Now and Then so far. So I would actually be interested to know if many of our other listeners have done that. But so I was just wondering, do you have a episode which particularly stands out to you, which has particularly stayed with you? And maybe Sandy and I should also answer this.
Yeah, I have listened to every episode, and it's been really interesting to hear how the show's shifted, and I'm looking forward to hearing about your experience with that. So yeah, I guess it might not come as a surprise that my favourite episode's probably the one with Kadri Avik, given the focus on vegan men. And yeah, I guess something that came up in that episode was the discussion about how veganism can both challenge masculinity for reasons we've probably discussed before, but also how it could sometimes reinforce and reproduce it if it's, seen as a form of neoliberal, patriarchal self-optimization. Buying into the vegans can be real men too, or if vegan men's mothers, or in a heterosexual context, if their partners are doing the bulk of the cooking. And yeah, I liked the Bob Peace episode too, which I re-listened to recently, and I think that was at the beginning, wasn't it? Maybe not the beginning, but earlier on. What about you, Sandy and Stephen?
Well, my favourite one, I guess, perhaps not surprising, is the one we've just done with Dom Stitchbury on male voice community choirs. Why is that? Well, obviously it's something that I'm interested in, I'm involved in, I'm in a choir. And what I liked about it really is it provides such a sort of positive example of engaging men, and I think to some extent, shifting their perceptions of themselves and of their relations with other men. I think Dom used the phrase "chipping away," and actually I think that's really important. And so I like the fact that he talked about that work, leading male voice choirs, in such a sort of sensitive and insightful way. And in saying that, I mean, I now realise, of course, that there's been many of our episodes which have addressed how to engage men and boys. There's the one with Daniel Principe on boys and pornography, Michael Flood on theory and practice, Nate Eisenstadt on working with discomfort, I mean, I could go on. Ken Harland taking boys seriously, and some of the earlier episodes, with Owen Thomas, on black masculinity in South London, Mike Ward in the South Wales valleys. All of these were actually relating to that one theme, which I really think is very, very important. So, but I will choose Dom Stitchery, and now I've managed to shoehorn all these other episodes in, and pass the baton to you, Stephen, to say what you liked.
Well, I was going to say, Sandy, you've mentioned about 10 episodes there, so I'm going to choose 3. Oh. First of all, I will just briefly mention the one with Angelica Ferrara, because I really like that. Obviously, that's very recent, issues of friendship among men, but also how that impacts on women. I think that's really powerful. Again, going back to what I was saying before about drawing the connections, that, we are all interconnected, and what impacts us, in turn, impacts on other people. So I also think that the episode with Jade Lavelle was really powerful in that respect, because I think she really powerfully showed, and I think she talked so sensitively about it as well, didn't she? About how, in domestic abuse, which is obviously something predominantly perpetrated by men, in turn impacts other boys and men who are growing up in that kind of environment, for example, and how that may then manifest itself in their lives and their behaviour. But actually, the episode I most just wanted to focus on was another recent one with Rob Oaken, because I do think that he's somebody whose work I've always found very kind of inspiring, with this voicemail magazine he's done. And I do like the idea that the podcast is trying to emulate that a little bit, obviously in a different media. But I also just found the fact that he was able to stay so positive, and hopeful in the face of this Donald Trump presidency, which obviously now we know is coming, I think was just very inspiring to me. And obviously, that's going to have huge ramifications for how we deal with the climate crisis. But I think the fact that he's taking this long historical view, over many decades, he has seen these changes happening. I think that perhaps that's why he's able to remain hopeful. So I'm carrying that with me.
Yeah, so this is a similar, but perhaps with a different nuance in terms of questions. Out of all the issues you've covered so far, have there been any that have felt particularly significant to you? And are there any topics that you'd really like to cover in future episodes?
Well, just building on the point that you made, Stephen, really, that what Bob Pease and Rob Oaken talked about, related to that is the episode with Lucy Delap, who talked quite a bit about the history of pro-feminism, particularly in the UK, the anti-sexist men's movement in the 1970s, 1980s. I thought that work was fascinating. So there's that. But broadening that out, I think on the relationship between masculinity and politics, there's been a lot to say on the podcast. I particularly liked the episode with Liz Pearson, and her great work on masculinity and extremism. This is amazing research and insight in some of the key figures and trends within the far right and within Islamist groups, and how she describes what's going on as a project of masculinity, I think. But I really thought that her work was great. But Jackson Katz has also talked about politics in the US. Lisa Segura has talked about the manosphere, which is also significant. So I think, masculinity and politics would be my particularly significant issue, but I could have chosen others. And I'm now worried that I've missed people out.
Well, you haven't said about future as well, Sandy. Do you have a future goal?
Covering the future, I do think perhaps we should try and do more on the global south. We tend to have, as far as I'm aware, listenership, which is UK, US, Australia, English-speaking countries. Not exclusively, but it would be good to broaden that out, and that might depend on the topics we choose. And again, I think we've tended to have guests on who we would largely agree with, and there may be a role for actually talking to people who we could have disagreements with. Perhaps we could disagree agreeably with them. But I don't know how that would go. But I'm not talking about figures on the far right, which will just descend into chaos and acrimony. But actually, there are obviously areas which are really worth discussion. So
yeah, we should be able to model that you can have healthy conflict and disagreement, and that it doesn't have to end in violence or anything like that, I suppose.
That would be rather tragic, wouldn't it?
Well, just to add my 2 cents to that, in terms of themes, one theme I wanted to mention here was around, the conversation with Daniel Principe about pornography, because I think, first of all, he spoke really powerfully about that, about the harms that's causing. But I do think that is, I think it's such a huge issue, which we're just not talking about anywhere near enough in all the different circles that that we all move in, because I do actually think that the impact it's having is absolutely massive. I think if young people, and especially if we think about young men, are growing up with this kind of content, incredibly misogynistic, abusive content a lot of the time, just normalized in their lives, like what impact is that having on them? And I actually think that it's playing probably a bigger role than we're realizing in like the recruitment of men to the manosphere and to the far right and things as well. I think there's a direct connection between these things. The fact that pornography is so widespread on the internet, I think it creates this space which is very hostile to women from the outset. And it's, a very macho space. And then I feel like it's a kind of that you can trace the lineage between that and then these other online spaces which are also hostile to women and where men feel like they have to project this certain type of masculinity. And I think the impact of that, I actually think that's probably has played a role in the election of Donald Trump, for example, So I don't think it's even just influencing our sexual lives. I think it's having a much bigger impact than we realise.
It'll be interesting in that context to see what the impact of the Australian legislation to, I think, is it ban social media for under 16?
Yeah,
is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that could be huge.
And then just to add as well, in terms of future episodes, just to link in with what you said, Sandy, I would really like to do more around colonialism as well and what that has to do with masculinity. And I do think that this again connects with ecofeminism, the intertwining of these worldviews, because I think what we were talking about in terms of this idea about masculinity as being very much separate from nature and above other animals and entitled to own and take over the land. That's about patriarchy, but it's also about colonialism and these kind of Western Enlightenment ideas. On the flip side of that, I guess, there are groups of people out there, for example, lots of indigenous communities who have very different ways of understanding the world, which potentially are actually a lot more sustainable. And I think there are lots of connections there with ecofeminist thinking, for example. So it would be great to do some episodes around that and how indigenous communities interact with masculinity.
Yeah, hearing some First Nations perspectives would be brilliant, and especially in the context of this episode too, with the climate crisis and looking at more sustainable and just different ways of relating to nature. And linking that to masculinity too. And I definitely agree about pornography being a really pertinent issue. And especially what's happening now. And how that might link to, certain backlashes against feminism and the stuff that's happening in the US with the whole your body, my choice. Because, I guess in many ways it feels like we've moved forward a lot, but in terms of feminist struggles, but not so much in others. There has been huge backlash. But I do feel like you've canvassed a lot of broad issues, which has been great. So maybe just revisiting some.
Yeah. Can I just add an issue, actually?
Sure.
It's occurred to me whilst we were talking. Well, it's partly prompted by what you've been saying, really. I mean, I think there's a huge issue about, green transition, what that actually means and how that relates to masculinity. When you think about some of the sort of fossil fuel type industries, oil, steel, cars, all of these, hugely dominated by men in those industries. And, we're talking about moving away. Well, what's that going to look like? And, are a lot of guys going to lose their jobs? And if they do, is that fuel for the far right? So I really do think we should try and talk about that. There are plenty of things that I think need to be done. I mean, to me, it'd be a no-brainer here in the UK to insulate all the houses, have a national programme on that, and there'll be a whole load of jobs to underpin that. And we could also think about care jobs as well. But it seems to me this is a potential point of serious tension, which is coming up this year and into the future. And thinking that through is very important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So which episode would you say that you've enjoyed recording so far? And I guess related to that, what might be the most bizarre thing that's happened during the making of Now and Men? And perhaps a bit more seriously, have there been any gendered issues that have surfaced in running the podcast at all?
Well, I suppose one thing I could say is we do get, we always encourage listeners to get in contact with us by emailing us at nowmen@gmail.com. And actually, we've had some wonderful people email us about, about their research or the research of somebody else, and could they come on, and we really welcome that. But we do also get quite a lot of emails from, I suppose, potentially like PR companies, or I don't know if it's AI bots or what, but some of them can be quite bizarre. And actually often it seems like they're trying to sell stuff aimed at men or a male audience, and they've obviously just Googled any podcast related to men, and often it actually does seem to connect to issues like male hair loss, or actually there's quite a lot around male fertility and sexual prowess, penis enlargement, and something about heart health. Do you remember that one, Sandy?
I certainly do. That was pretty bizarre. But I don't know. I hesitate to sort of write all this stuff off completely. I don't particularly want to promote particular products, but when people are approaching you saying they've got sort of sex tech and wearables, you think, well, what's that? Well, it turns out to be some sort of ring that you put on your dick, which then connects to your phone and tells you about your cardiac health. And you think, ooh, that, I don't want to undermine, the seriousness of issues about, older men's health. But at the same time, I'm not the guy to ask those questions, I feel.
Well, and I think there is a serious point there, because I think some of the stuff is actually exploiting male anxieties, isn't it? And all the pressures on men to be, performing, very athletically all the time. But on the other hand, of course, we don't have adverts on Now and Men. So if you suddenly see me and Sandy starting to sell some products, then you know why.
Yeah.
These are very important and real issues, aren't they? I mean, anxiety around hair loss and men's sexuality.
Yeah.
But yes,
Absolutely.
maybe not the time to be selling things to listeners.
Was that your most bizarre then?
That's my most bizarre. Yeah. What would you like to add, Sandy?
Well, I wasn't going to mention that one, but you brought it up. But I think unusual, I would say, was when we went to Richard Bliss's exhibition in Bishop Auckland in the northeast of England. Where we went round and looked at I think examples of about 40 different men's shirts that he had stitched himself. All representing different aspects of masculinity. And then we had a great chat with him about why he'd done that and his background, and so on and so forth. So that was unusual, and that's the only time I think we've done an exhibition and then an interview face to face. I mean, almost all our interviews, apart from that one, I think, have been online. So that was unusual. And the only other thing that occurred to me was when we interviewed Romit Chowdhury about his research in Indian cities. And he talked about riding round with tuk-tuk drivers in their little carts, racing around the city, trying to find excitement, but also survive in this very difficult environment. And it just struck me as a sort of rather extraordinary piece of research to be doing. So that was unusual, but definitely fun and interesting.
Yeah. One thing as well, just in relation to your question, Cassie, because you did ask about gender issues as well.
Yes.
And I think something which Sandy and I are constantly chewing over is the kind of complex dynamics of running the podcast, because given that we both do subscribe to pro-feminism, and I guess that kind of underpins the podcast, that it's trying to get those kind of pro-feminist ideas out there to a broader audience, or kind of critical thinking about masculinity. And so how do you juggle that, with the fact that, I guess, principally, what does that look like? What does allyship look like? Well, I guess it's about listening, isn't it? Listening to women's voices and listening to what feminists have to say and then applying that to our lives. So there's a kind of discomfort there because hopefully, on the one hand, we are elevating some of those voices and work and research. But at the same time, this is a podcast run by two men. So how do we deal with that? How do we get these issues out there, and how do we speak about these issues in a way which hopefully people, including men, will listen to, without, I suppose, elevating ourselves too much, making it too much about us. And that's something we struggle with, isn't it, Sandy, is that do listeners want to hear more from us, or actually should we kind of keep ourselves as kind of quiet and hidden as possible? I'm not sure what the answer there is. But I think your work also, you deal with questions of allyship as well, don't you, Cassie, with your work, which are really interesting.
Yeah. I guess allyship in terms of that to non-human animals, and I guess reflecting on the power relations, right? Belonging to a group of oppressors, having power over animals, and trying to balance that need to centre animals' experiences and voices when they don't have access to language in the same way we do. And yeah, I guess also this misconception too that animals are voiceless, which isn't necessarily true. Recognizing that they do have agency and that they are protesting the harms that are perpetrated against them, and just trying to tune into how to listen. So yeah, I guess listening is important. I was thinking too, just going back to the question of activism too, if you would consider this podcast as a form of activism, if we were to redefine it.
That's an interesting question. I think we have discussed that as well. I'm not sure we've used the word activism, but we have discussed whether it's a campaigning podcast, whether it should be a campaigning podcast. Are we trying to, shift opinions and attitudes and behaviours out there, even if in a very minor way, or are we just providing a platform where people can talk about their work in more depth? And present that to a wider audience. And I guess just through choice of guests, in a way, we're making decisions about who should come on and what issues we think are significant, and what do we want to hear more about, and what do we think our listeners might want to hear more about. So it probably crosses some boundary between awareness raising and campaigning, but probably more on the awareness raising for me. I don't know what you'd say, Stephen, to that.
No, I agree, really. I think for me, I do kind of see it as activism in a broad sense that we've described. But yeah, I don't think it's my job or our job to kind of try to ram certain ideas down people's throats. For me, I actually think probably the most valuable thing we can do is just get different ideas out there from the ones which people might be hearing more commonly in everyday life, and encourage people to think critically about things they encounter in society, and to question things, and just highlight some of the amazing work that other people are doing, really, and get that out there, because I think more people need to hear it, like your work, Cassie, for example, so yeah.
I think you also asked us at the start about the most enjoyable episode for us.
Yes.
I could say something on that. I mean, I particularly liked, and I'm only going to mention one now, the interview we did with Jens van Tricht on his book, Why Feminism is Good for Men. And the reason I like that, I think, he talks in very sort of personal terms about his journey, really, as a man, and how he got to be who he is today. But also, I think he would accept he's not in some way the finished article, that his life, his activity is a work in progress. And I like that sense that we got from him there. And I think he was very honest and very insightful about his own perspectives and behaviours. And he also told some lovely anecdotes as well about his father and his mother. I don't know if you remember the one where I think I mentioned this before, but he's about 3 or 4 years old. His father kicks this football into the sky, and he said, I'm not even sure, I don't remember where it landed, or even if it did land, and this was all about his father's power. And then later on, he talked about being in I think it was a voice workshop with his father, and his dad, as an older man, was was almost unable to speak, and he saw how he wasn't this powerful figure, and he was, in some way much diminished. It was a fascinating little anecdote which said so much about, who Jens is and who he connected to in his family. So,
without wishing to grill you too much, Sandy, I can't. Well, I can't help but know. I actually feel very privileged to get to do this podcast with you, because you've been around in this field, doing this work for many decades. You know, I remember when I first started doing my PhD, my work in this area, multiple people said to me, "Oh, you need to meet Sandy. You need to go and speak to Sandy." You know? So I feel very privileged to get to learn from you, you know, when doing this. So I was just wondering, like, would you say you've learned anything new from doing the podcast? Or is it kind of more about, you know, that it's re-emphasizing things you were already kind of, you know, familiar with? Or, yeah, do you think you've learned anything new from this process?
Well, it's very kind of you to puff me up in that way, Stephen. You know, no, very kind. And, you know, obviously I think just to return the favour, it's been great working with you. And, you know, I think the sort of cross-generational aspect of our friendship is quite significant too, that we bring very different experiences from different times as well. So, but in terms of what you asked, I just feel that there's so much fascinating work going on out there, and there's a great community of people working on all kinds of rich topics, you know. I mean, in some ways, I'd quite like to bring all our guests together one day, you know, and just allow them to kind of, you know, cross-fertilise, because I think it would be really interesting. It'd be great. But also, it's been very humbling working on the podcast, I think, and recognising too that everyone is different. You know, they're different in how they engage with the interview. You know, some people just say their bit and they don't want to hear any more about it. They don't want to promote it. Other people are quite keen to promote their work and so on. But I also like the fact that the podcast allows for some exploration of the sort of the connections between the personal and the professional. You know, and when you read some academic work, and it's mainly academics we've had on, but not exclusively, you know, you can read their work, but they're not necessarily talking about, you know, how they got to do what they do, what motivated them. And I think it's been very nice on the podcast to be able to ask people a bit more about that. You know, and we're not saying tell us about your parents and your family life, and of course some people don't want to talk about that, but I think some do, and you know, most will talk a little bit about the journey that they've gone on to get where they are now, and that to me is quite an important aspect of the podcast, really. You know, reflecting to listeners, you know, the stories, the journeys.
I guess as we're marking the new year, I wonder if each of you has a person that you found particularly inspiring from 2024, and what messages you might like listeners to take away from the podcast and into their lives in the new year.
Well, I mean, actually, just to go back to what you were saying, I would actually say my parents as an inspirational figure. You know, Sandy's done this great research about how our biggest role models are invariably people close to us. And so that's definitely true for me. Especially, you know, obviously I have moved to Australia in the last year, so I am much further away from them than I'm used to. And frankly, I wouldn't be doing this work were it not for them. You know, like, I think the way that they brought me up, the way that, you know, they've encouraged me to question things. So I'm indebted to them, you know, and I think it shows as well, you know, the impact that parents can have in that way. So yeah, they are my primary inspirations, I would say. And in terms of messages, I also would go back to something Sandy said, which was the Jens episode, because something I think really important that Jens talked about was the process and the importance of the process in the work that we do. Because I think when I was younger, without wishing to make this all about my personal life, you know, I was quite heavily involved in left-wing politics, which was all about the end point, you know, that, we'll achieve this revolution and then everything will be fine. And in the end, I actually found that quite unsatisfying. And I think because of the fact that, you know, well, it doesn't matter what we're working towards if we're not actually in the here and now creating the world that we want to live in. So I think this does go back to what we were talking about earlier about, you know, the personal is political, and actually I think trying to create the society that we want through our own everyday practices is the first thing we can do, and hopefully by doing that will encourage other people to want to come along on that journey with us.
Brilliant. What about you, Sandy?
Well, I feel slightly adverse to choosing heroes or heroines. You know, I come from an era of the Stranglers, no more heroes anymore. But anyway, leaving that aside, I'm happy to suggest one or two. I mean, my fairly obvious heroine would be Gisèle Pellicot, in waiving anonymity in the mass rape trial in France. And the way that she stood there and said, you know, the shame is not for us, it's for them. And she obviously meant the men who had been involved in the abuse. That to me was just an extraordinary moment, really. But I must have an honourable mention, perhaps for a man as well, and that would be for Jimmy Carter, the US president, who's just recently died, aged 100. Now, his record as a president was quite checkered, is not very favourably regarded, although I think his reputation is improving actually over time. But he did achieve a huge amount later in life, and he argued consistently that gender inequality is the main driver of men's violence against women. It's sustained by patriarchal beliefs, and also tackled conservative religious traditions within that. So I think that was hugely important. He was part of the elders group with Nelson Mandela and others who tried to have an influence on these kinds of issues and human rights issues more broadly. And I like the fact that he seemed to remain idealistic, despite frustration at the uphill struggle of getting men to tackle violence against women. So I think, he is something of a hero for those of us on the progressive side who are working on gender equality and men's involvement in it. If people wanted to read more, by the way, there is a great TED talk that he did in about 2015, and there's also a very recent article by Jackson Katz, one of our guests. So we can put something on that in the show notes.
What about you, Cassie?
Yeah, I probably am a bit adverse to the hero kind of heroine. Well, I guess because no one's perfect, right? And I think that it is sometimes their everyday influences that can have the biggest impact on us. So yeah, my mum and my brother and family and friends have been really inspiring. I guess someone who I've found inspirational, and I guess while I haven't agreed with everything that she said, is Georgie Purcell, she's an elected MP for the Animal Justice Party here in Victoria, Australia. And I guess, well, for one thing, it's just really promising to see someone elected in that position to advocate for animals, and she's done a lot in terms of leading a parliamentary inquiry into pig welfare and campaigning to end greyhound racing. And yeah, I guess she's drawn attention to sexist media reporting too. Earlier this year, there was a media outlet, Channel 9, used a digitally altered picture of her where her breasts were enlarged and she was edited to wear more revealing clothing. And she called it out really effectively, and it did do a lot to highlight sexism in the media. So I guess, yeah, I think that the way that she's brought attention to sexism and discrimination against animals too has been pretty powerful.
Absolutely.
The thing that I think about, and you probably get this from my previous comments, is how do we respond to or survive authoritarian times, really. And to me that's really about not just thinking what can I do, but thinking about what can we do in whatever way that is. So finding like-minded others, working together, trying to remain hopeful, these are the things that motivate me for the next year or more.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Sandy. I was going to kind of talk back about everyday activism and about how, we should all kind of see every choice that we make as having some kind of impact, because otherwise it's just too disempowering, isn't it? But I guess, moving the emphasis away from the individual and towards the collective. So how can we influence other people in our lives, and how can we kind of band together to make change, I think is, a really insightful point.
Well, thank you both. I've really enjoyed doing this, and I'm very grateful to you, Cassie, for being willing to kind of hold this conversation with us.
It's been a privilege. Thank you so much for making such a great podcast and having me on today.
Well, it's our pleasure.
Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, and we'd also like to thank all of you listeners, who have listened to the podcast for the last 3.5 years. I think that is what motivates us more than anything to keep doing it. And to help us grow further, we would really appreciate it if you can share it with your friends or your family or colleagues or in your teaching, for example. And in particular as well, if you can leave a review on your chosen podcast service, that would also help to spread it further. And thank you to everyone who's already done that. And take care, and we'll be back with another episode soon.
Bye for now.